Elijah received a call from God in the midst of one of the darkest times in Israel's history. Elijah was a Tishbite from the region of Gilead in Transjordan. He is regarded as one of the most important prophets in Israel's history. Even though there is no book written in his honor, the Book of Kings covers a greater portion of his life than the lives of most kings. Elijah was a famous prophet who lived in the 9th century and worked in the northern kingdom during the reigns of Ahab and his son Ahaziah. Despite the specific commands given to Israel not to mix the worship of pagan gods with the worship of the true God, King Ahab encouraged the Israelites to combine their worship of God with pagan practices. He set an example for them to follow, which led to idolatry becoming a significant social issue in Israel. For these sins, Elijah told Ahab that Israel would experience a drought. Elijah declared, "As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years except at my word." 1 Kings 17 verses 1. Exhausted, Elijah collapsed to the ground. The message of the drought, the idolatry of Samaria, the wrath of King Ahab, and the realization that he couldn't return home were enough to overwhelm him. But Elijah had faith. He decided to submit to God's will and establish his home by the Cherith brook. After a while, the brook dried up. Elijah witnessed the brook's flow diminish until it finally ceased altogether. His access to water was cut off. In a land like Israel, rain and dew were life-giving and life-preserving necessities. Elijah finally experienced the drought he had prayed for, yet even though it was necessary for survival, he did not pray for rain. Instead, he prioritized carrying out God's will. Then the word of the Lord came to him saying, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and stay there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you." 1 Kings 17 verses 8 to 9. God led Elijah from the dry brook to a Gentile city, a unique and challenging move for Elijah. This transplantation made him stronger. Zarephath was part of the region associated with Queen Jezebel. Elijah was entering enemy territory to show God's power in a land where Baal worship prevailed. The widow of Zarephath. In the ancient world, widows were often impoverished, living on the fringes of society. They relied on the charity of others and were occasionally forced into prostitution. Their clothing revealed their social status, as seen in Genesis 38 verses 19. Widows, orphans, and prostitutes occupied the lowest social positions and lived in constant fear of starvation and homelessness. God instructed Elijah to seek provision from a Gentile widow. This may have seemed illogical, as widows were among the poorest in society. However, Jesus later used this example to illustrate God's right to choose a people for himself. But I tell you truly, many widows were in Israel in Elijah's days, when the sky was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a great famine. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in Sidon, Luke 4, verses 25 to 26. When Elijah arrived in Zarephath, he met the widow gathering firewood. He asked her for water and a piece of bread. The widow revealed her poverty, explaining that she had only a handful of flour and a little oil. She was preparing her last meal for herself and her son before resigning to their fate. Despite this, Elijah made a bold request. "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first and bring it to me. Afterward, make some for yourself and your son." This tested the widow's faith, yet Elijah assured her of God's promise. "The bowl of flour shall not be exhausted, nor shall the jar of oil run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." 1 Kings 17, verses 13 to 14. She obeyed, and God fulfilled his promise. The flour and oil did not run out, sustaining Elijah, the widow, and her household throughout the famine, the widow's tragedy and God's miracle. After some time, the widow's son became ill and died. In grief, she questioned Elijah, blaming herself for past sins. Elijah took the boy, carried him to his upper room, and prayed fervently, "O Lord my God, let this child's life return to him." God's grace, in action, the widow's faith journey mirrors the kind of faith God calls each of us to have. Her obedience to Elijah's request, despite her dire circumstances, not only led to her survival, but also demonstrated the boundless provision and compassion of God. This story highlights how God often uses the least likely people and the most challenging situations to accomplish his purposes. Elijah's role as God's prophet required him to trust in God's plan completely. Moving from place to place, first to the brook, then to Zarephath, strengthened his reliance on God's instructions. In the process, Elijah not only witnessed miracles, but also became an instrument of God's work in transforming lives. God's power over life and death. The miraculous revival of the widow's son serves as a powerful reminder of God's sovereignty over life and death. It shows us that God's power is not limited to providing physical sustenance, but extends to restoring life and hope where all seems lost. Elijah's persistent prayer demonstrates the importance of interceding for others with faith. His unwavering trust in God led to a miraculous outcome, teaching us the value of earnest prayer and dependence on God in difficult times. Here are lessons for today. Number 1. The faith beyond logic. The widow's willingness to give her last meal to Elijah, trusting in God's promise, reflects the kind of faith that moves mountains. Sometimes God asks us to take steps of faith that may defy our understanding, but his plans are always perfect. Number 2, God's provision is sufficient. Just as the flour and oil sustained the widow and her household daily, God's provision in our lives is sufficient for every need. We may not receive everything all at once, but he supplies what we need, moment by moment. Number 3, hope in despair. The widow's story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, when all hope seems lost, God can intervene and bring about restoration.